This story is titled, My Golden Brother Got My Fiancée Pregnant. My parents took his side and covered it up. Near the end of her pregnancy, they tried to force me to raise his child and pay their bills. But I already started planning my revenge. Hey Reddit, I'm a 30-year-old guy, and I never thought I'd be sharing something like this with strangers on the internet. But I need to get this off my chest because I was completely blindsided by the three people who were supposed to have my back unconditionally: my wife, my younger brother, and my own mother. Here's how my entire world came crashing down. I work as a cybersecurity specialist and have been in this field for the past 5 years. I started at a small tech security firm right out of college and worked my way up to senior threat analyst. Our company handles network protection, data breach prevention, and security audits for various businesses. It's not the sexiest work in the world, I'll admit, but it pays well enough that I was able to buy a decent 2-bedroom house in a nice neighborhood about 2 years ago. I purchased it before getting married, which would prove to be incredibly important later on. My company might not have the name recognition of Google or Apple, but we're solid and stable. I earn a great base salary with annual bonuses that usually hit around $15,000 to $20,000. The health benefits actually cover things when you need them, and they match my 401k contributions generously. It's the kind of financial stability that most guys my age are still dreaming about achieving. My boss, Victor, is a 44-year-old guy who really took me under his wing when I first started at the company. He's this old-school security expert who transitioned into management but still keeps his hands dirty with actual code work. Victor didn't just teach me security best practices and technical skills. He showed me how to navigate company politics effectively, how to negotiate my salary properly, and even helped me secure an extra $14,000 on my last promotion. He also taught me how to manage client expectations without promising the impossible, which has been invaluable in this industry. Then there's my wife, well, now ex-wife, Natalie. She's 27 years old and walked into my life at a friend's house party about 3 years ago. She was this gorgeous brunette who worked as a dietitian at the local hospital, specializing in diabetes care. We had this instant chemistry that everyone at the party noticed immediately. It was one of those rare connections where you feel like you've known someone for years, even though you just met. What first caught my attention wasn't just her looks, but how she absolutely lit up when talking about her job. She didn't just give surface-level responses about helping people eat better. Instead, she could explain complex nutritional procedures and dietary management techniques in a way that made sense even to a tech guy like me. She was smart, dedicated, and genuinely invested in her career, exactly the kind of woman I thought I was looking for in a life partner. We dated for a full year before I decided to propose to her. When I got down on one knee, she actually cried tears of joy and said yes without hesitation. We had a small but beautiful wedding at her parents' lake house with just 50 or so people in attendance, close friends and family members who really mattered to us. I spent 2 months' salary on her engagement ring, a stunning 2.3-carat diamond set in a platinum band. Looking back, every penny felt worth it at the time. To give you some context about my family dynamics, my younger brother Greg is 26 years old and has always been what you'd call the golden child in our family. Despite being 4 years younger than me, he somehow always managed to be the center of attention wherever we went. He's better looking than me, much better with people in social situations, and has this natural charm that allowed him to manipulate our mom into getting whatever he wanted throughout our childhood and teenage years. Greg played varsity football in high school, while I was the quiet chess club kid who spent his free time building security systems and learning programming languages. It was a classic case of the popular athlete versus the studious introvert. Our family dynamic created this mama's boy situation where I was always the quiet, responsible son who worked hard and followed the rules, but somehow never quite measured up in our mother's eyes. Dad was always fair and treated both of us equally, but Greg was definitely mom's favorite, and that dynamic never changed as we got older. The contrast between Greg and me became almost comical at family gatherings over the years. I remember one Christmas about 3 years ago when Greg showed up 2 hours late without the side dish he had promised to bring, but instead brought along some random girl he had met the night before. Instead of being annoyed at his irresponsibility, Mom immediately started fussing over both of them, making sure they had drinks and were comfortable. Meanwhile, I had been there since early morning, helping Dad prep the turkey and get everything ready. Dad just shook his head at the whole situation and quietly poured me an extra glass of bourbon when Mom wasn't looking. My dad is a retired civil engineer, logical, methodical, and someone who always plays by the rules. He's the one who taught me practical life skills, like how to change the oil in my first car and how to fix a leaky faucet. He never fully understood the technical aspects of my cybersecurity work, but he respected that I had found a solid, stable career path and was building something for myself. Mom, on the other hand, is a former high school French teacher who retired early when Dad's engineering firm really took off financially. She always had this soft spot for Greg, whom she affectionately called her sensitive, artistic soul. Even as adults, she would make excuses for his behavior and bail him out of problems that he should have handled himself. After college, I went straight into cybersecurity and started building my career immediately. Greg, however, bounced around between different jobs for years. He would work somewhere for just a few months, get bored or frustrated, then quit with some elaborate story about toxic management or unrealistic expectations. Meanwhile, his mounting credit card bills somehow always became Mom and Dad's financial problem to solve. I ended up bailing Greg out of minor legal trouble on 2 separate occasions. The first time was for driving with an expired license, and the second was for trespassing at an ex-girlfriend's apartment building. These incidents cost me nearly $3,500 total, money that Greg promised to pay back as soon as things turned around for him. Of course, that repayment never materialized. Eventually, I decided to help Greg get a position at my company in the sales department. Victor, my boss, was initially hesitant about hiring him. He had actually met Greg at our company Christmas party the year before and wasn't particularly impressed with his attitude or professionalism. But I vouched for Greg and promised Victor that I would keep him in line and make sure he performed well. Greg had the natural charm that could work well in sales, and I figured having him at the same company would give him the stability he desperately needed. Plus, I believe that family should look out for family, right? The sales job at our company came with a good base salary plus commission structure, which wasn't bad at all for someone with Greg's spotty employment history. I spent 3 entire weekends coaching him on our products, teaching him the industry terminology, and explaining our client base. I made it clear to him that this was his chance to finally build something real and stable for himself. Greg seemed genuinely grateful for the opportunity and said all the right things about wanting to prove himself. When I officially introduced them, Victor gave me one of those, "I hope you know what you're doing," looks that I should have paid more attention to. Natalie and I settled into married life pretty smoothly during that first year. Our relationship wasn't the kind of Hollywood movie romance you see in films, but it was solid, comfortable, and built on mutual respect and shared goals. We talked seriously about starting a family, maybe in a year or two once we were more financially established. I spent most weekends working on home improvement projects. I installed a brand new kitchen island, built a deck in the backyard, and tackled all those typical homeowner tasks that come with buying your first house. Natalie took charge of decorating the interior, and she had a real talent for it. She transformed our place into something that looked like it belonged in one of those glossy home design magazines you see at the doctor's office. I invested about $22,000 in home improvements over that first year of marriage. We put in new hardwood flooring throughout the living room, completely upgraded the master bathroom with a rainfall shower and heated floors, and professionally landscaped the entire backyard. Every penny I invested was not only making our home more beautiful, but also significantly raising the property value, plus giving us a space that we both genuinely loved coming home to. That first year of marriage was genuinely good for us. We developed comfortable routines that felt natural and enjoyable. Saturday mornings meant homemade waffles and coffee while reading the newspaper together. Wednesday nights were our designated date nights where we would try new restaurants or catch a movie. We took occasional weekend trips to her parents' lake house, which was always relaxing and gave us time to disconnect from work stress. We hosted regular game nights with our circle of friends, took a couples cooking class together at the community center, and did all those typical couple activities that you're supposed to do when you're building a life together. From the outside looking in, we seemed genuinely happy and content. About a year into our marriage, I got assigned to a major project at work that would prove to be both a career opportunity and the beginning of the end for my marriage. The irony isn't lost on me now, but I was tasked with rebuilding the entire security infrastructure for a large hospital chain. I started working significantly longer hours, often coming home well after Natalie was already asleep for the night. Weekend work became the norm rather than the exception, and the project that was originally supposed to last 3 months ended up stretching to 6 months. I started missing our Saturday morning waffle tradition and those precious Wednesday date nights that had become such an important part of our routine. This project was a legitimate career maker for me. Successfully implementing a comprehensive new security system for a $2.5 billion company would put me on the fast track for a senior architect position, which meant a significantly bigger salary, stock options, and much more control over which projects I worked on in the future. I explained all of this to Natalie in detail, and she seemed to understand the importance of this opportunity for our long-term financial security. She was actually supportive at first, and even brought me dinner at the office several times during those first weeks when the overtime was really intense. During this period when I was consumed with work, Natalie made a new friend at the hospital where she worked. This woman named Olivia was a travel dietitian from Chicago who was doing a 6-month rotation at our local hospital. Olivia was everything that Natalie wasn't: single, completely carefree, and kind of wild in her lifestyle choices. Suddenly, Natalie started going out for girls' nights with Olivia and coming home with stories about clubs and bars that I didn't even know existed in our city. I was too buried in my project deadlines and technical challenges to really notice how much things were starting to change in our relationship dynamic. Things started feeling genuinely weird about 4 months before everything completely imploded in my face. This was right around the time when my big project was finally wrapping up. The security system had been successfully launched, and I was really looking forward to getting back to some semblance of normal life with Natalie. But somewhere along the way, while I had been buried in work, normal had shifted dramatically, and I was completely oblivious to what had been happening. Natalie's schedule became increasingly unpredictable in ways that didn't make sense. She had always been extremely consistent with her hospital shifts, 3 10-hour days followed by 4 days off like clockwork. But suddenly, she was picking up extra shifts constantly and going out with coworkers much more frequently than she ever had before. When I asked her about the sudden changes, she would give vague explanations about the hospital being short-staffed, or mention that her friend Taylor was going through a difficult breakup and needed emotional support. One night, I decided to check our bank statements, something I hadn't done in months due to being so consumed with work. I noticed that Natalie had been withdrawing $200 to $300 in cash every single week for the past 2 months. This was completely new behavior for her. We had always used credit cards for almost everything to earn rewards points. When I brought it up casually in conversation, she said something vague about preferring cash for small purchases and girls' nights out. On the surface, her explanation made sense, but it represented a significant change in her spending habits that I had never seen before. I made several attempts to reconnect with her as my work project was winding down. I suggested we take a weekend trip together to celebrate the successful completion of my project and get back to spending quality time together. She told me she couldn't get the time off work, which seemed strange given how flexible her schedule had always been. I offered to cook her favorite dinner at home, something that used to be a regular romantic gesture between us. She texted me at the last minute saying that Olivia needed her help with something urgent and she wouldn't be home for dinner. A rational person might have connected these dots much sooner than I did, but I was still operating on a foundation of trust that had been built over years together. 6 years of working in cybersecurity had trained me to look for multiple data points and patterns before declaring that a security breach had occurred. I needed more concrete evidence before I could accept that something was seriously wrong. Then there was the phone situation, which became increasingly obvious and troubling. Natalie would be texting constantly throughout the day with this little secretive smile on her face that I recognized from our early dating days. But the second I walked into whatever room she was in, her phone would immediately flip over face down on the table. When I asked casually who she was texting with, she would give generic responses like, "Just Taylor," or "Work group chat," but her body language told a different story entirely. After I had successfully gotten Greg the sales job at my company, he started showing up to our office happy hours much more frequently than he ever had before. Natalie began attending these events too, saying she wanted to be supportive of both of us in our careers. There was one particular night at Murphy's Bar that should have been a massive red flag for me. I got stuck talking to a client who had shown up unexpectedly, and I was trapped in conversation with them for about 45 minutes. When I finally managed to break free and rejoin the group, I found Natalie and Greg sitting together in a corner booth, engaged in what appeared to be an incredibly deep and intimate conversation. Their heads were almost touching across the small table, and they both jumped slightly when I walked up to them. Greg immediately launched into this elaborate story about a potential sales lead at the hospital where Natalie worked. He explained how they had been discussing ways for him to get an in with the procurement department, and how Natalie might be able to help him understand the decision-making process there. On the surface, his explanation made perfect business sense and seemed completely innocent. What didn't make sense was how Greg's hand had been lingering on Natalie's arm for just a beat too long when I approached, or how Natalie's cheeks were flushed in that particular way I recognized from our early dating days when she was excited or attracted to someone. But again, this was my own brother and my own wife we're talking about. I filed this incident away as an anomaly rather than recognizing it as part of a pattern that was developing right under my nose. Greg also started showing up at our house unannounced much more frequently than he ever had before. He would bring Natalie these little thoughtful gifts, her favorite specialty tea from that expensive shop downtown, fancy chocolates from the boutique confectionery, or scented candles and fragrances she particularly loved. When I thanked him for being so considerate and thoughtful, he would just shrug it off and say something like, "Just looking out for my sister-in-law." At the time, I actually thought it was really nice that he was making such an effort to build a good relationship with my wife. Looking back now, I realize how absolutely clueless I was about what was really happening. Meanwhile, at work, Greg was actually performing surprisingly well in his sales position. He hit 115% of his quota for 3 months in a row, which was genuinely impressive for someone who had struggled to maintain steady employment for years. He started dressing much better, seemed more focused and motivated than I had ever seen him, and appeared to have finally found his professional groove. I was secretly proud that my decision to help him get this job had paid off so well. Co-workers would regularly congratulate me on helping to straighten Greg out and get his life on track, and I felt this completely misplaced sense of brotherly accomplishment about his success. Then, about 2 months after all these strange behavioral changes had begun, Natalie started getting sick in the mornings on a regular basis. I would hear her in the bathroom around 6 in the morning, with the shower running to mask the sounds of what was obviously morning sickness. One particular morning, I got up early to check on her and found her kneeling on the bathroom floor. I held her hair back while she threw up, and afterwards I gently suggested that maybe she might be pregnant. Her reaction was completely unexpected. She freaked out in a way that seemed like genuine panic rather than joy or excitement. She insisted it was just a stomach bug that was going around the hospital where she worked, and that there was nothing to worry about. But I had been discreetly tracking her menstrual cycle on my personal calendar because we had been supposedly trying to start a family together. She was 2 weeks late, which had never happened before in all the time we had been together. Despite her insistence that it was just illness, she immediately scheduled an appointment with her doctor. However, she made it very clear that she didn't want me to accompany her to the appointment, saying it was nothing serious and she didn't want me to miss work over something so minor. I didn't press her on the issue, figuring she would tell me the results when she was ready. Maybe she wanted to be absolutely certain before sharing potentially exciting news with me. Or maybe she was worried about getting my hopes up if it turned out to be a false alarm. Around this same time, my friend Thomas, who works in hospital administration at a different facility than Natalie's, met me for drinks one evening. During our conversation, he asked how things were going at home, and I mentioned Natalie's mysterious stomach bug that had been persisting for weeks. Thomas immediately grinned and said, "Morning sickness, bro," with a knowing wink. When I told him that Natalie had denied being pregnant and insisted it was just a regular illness, he got this strange, uncomfortable look on his face that I couldn't quite interpret. "You two are still trying for a baby, right?" he asked. And when I confirmed that we were, he just nodded slowly and deliberately changed the subject to something completely unrelated. Later that same night, after I had gotten home, Thomas sent me a text message that said, "Hey man, not trying to cause any trouble, but how's Greg doing at your company these days?" I replied that Greg was doing fine and hitting all his sales targets, but Thomas never explained why he had asked that particular question or what had prompted him to bring up my brother. Around this same period, my mother started acting strangely as well, though I didn't connect it to everything else that was happening at the time. She began calling Natalie directly on her personal cell phone instead of calling our home phone like she had always done before. When I happened to be around during these phone conversations, Natalie would say generic things like, "Yes, I got that recipe you mentioned," or "I'll definitely check out that sale you told me about." But the conversation seemed to go on much longer than discussions about recipes or shopping would typically warrant. Once I walked into the living room while they were talking on speakerphone, and my mother quickly said, "Oh, David just came home, so we'll talk later," and abruptly ended the call. Mom had always liked Natalie well enough, but suddenly they seemed to have developed this new level of closeness and intimacy that I wasn't part of. They started going shopping together regularly, developed inside jokes that I didn't understand, and seemed to share secrets that didn't include me. The most significant gesture happened when Mom gave Natalie a family heirloom necklace that had been promised to my future wife since I was a kid. When I mentioned being surprised by this gesture, since it seemed early in our marriage for such a meaningful gift, Mom just said, "Well, she is your wife now, isn't she?" Something in her tone felt off and defensive, like she was justifying the decision to herself as much as to me. Everything fell apart completely on a Tuesday in March, and it happened in the most unexpected way possible. I was working from home that day while Natalie had a scheduled shift at the hospital. I had made plans to surprise her with takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant when she got home that evening, hoping to reconnect after weeks of feeling this growing distance between us that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Around lunchtime, I received an email notification about a furniture delivery that I had been waiting on for weeks. The delivery was scheduled for the following day, but I needed to confirm the specific time slot with the company. I couldn't find the original confirmation email in my inbox to reply to, and I started searching through my email folders to locate it. We shared a desktop computer in our home office that both of us used regularly. Natalie used it for her continuing education courses and professional development, while I used it for personal projects and managing our household finances. I was logged into my own email account initially, but I remembered that Natalie sometimes organized my emails when she used the computer. She was obsessive about maintaining inbox zero, while I typically let emails pile up until I absolutely had to deal with them. I figured that maybe Natalie had seen the furniture confirmation email and moved it to an organized folder or possibly forwarded it to herself so she could help coordinate the delivery. So I logged out of my email account and logged into Natalie's email to see if she had the furniture information saved anywhere. That's when I saw it. An email thread between her and my mother with the subject line, "Don't let David find out." My stomach immediately dropped to the floor, and I sat there staring at that subject line for what felt like an eternity. There was this voice in my head saying, "Close the browser right now and respect her privacy." But there was a much louder voice screaming, "What the hell is this about?" I started reading through the email thread with my hands literally shaking, and it felt like getting punched in the face repeatedly by someone I trusted completely. The emails went back 3 full months and contained detailed discussions between my mother and my wife about how to hide Natalie's ongoing affair with my brother Greg. The earliest emails in the thread were somewhat vague, with my mom asking Natalie if she was absolutely sure about this path and warning her to be much more careful around me to avoid getting caught. But the emails quickly became explicitly detailed about their deception. My own mother was actively giving my wife advice on how to cover up her affair with my brother. She provided specific guidance on when to claim extra hospital shifts, what excuses would be most believable, and she even offered her own house as a meeting place when my dad was out playing golf. One email literally read, "Frank always plays 18 holes on Tuesdays, so you have at least 4 hours of guaranteed privacy." My mother had created a detailed schedule of when my father would be out of the house specifically so that Natalie and Greg could use their home for their affair. The systematic nature of this betrayal was what hit me the hardest. This wasn't just some impulsive mistake or a moment of weakness that had gotten out of hand. It was a calculated, ongoing deception that involved the 3 people who were supposed to love me most in this world. There were time-specific alibis, detailed contingency plans for different scenarios, and even a shared calendar where they tracked my work schedule and planned their secret meetups accordingly. Then I found the absolute bombshell that destroyed whatever was left of my world. The most recent emails in the thread were discussing Natalie's pregnancy. She was 2 months pregnant, as confirmed by her doctor, and they weren't sure whether the baby was mine or Greg's because the timing of conception overlapped with both of us. There was an email where Natalie was panicking after I had suggested that her morning sickness might indicate pregnancy, and my own mother was telling my wife to pass the baby off as mine, regardless of who the actual father was. My mother literally wrote, "David would be a better father anyway, and what he doesn't know won't hurt him." She was actively encouraging my wife to lie to me about the paternity of this child and potentially trick me into raising my brother's baby without my knowledge or consent. The entire email conversation read like something out of a conspiracy thriller novel. There were detailed discussions about creating believable alibis, backup plans for different contingencies, and even strategies for what to do if I became suspicious. They had thought of everything, except for the possibility that I might accidentally stumble across their communications while looking for a completely unrelated email about furniture delivery. I sat at that computer for what must have been several hours, reading through every single email in that thread. Each one was more devastating than the last, and I kept desperately hoping to find something, anything, That would tell me this was all some kind of misunderstanding or sick joke. But there was no ambiguity whatsoever. It was painfully, brutally clear what had been happening behind my back for months. I took screenshots of everything I had found and saved them all to a flash drive, making sure I had complete documentation of their betrayal. Then I printed out the most incriminating emails and organized them in a folder. My hands were still shaking, but I knew I needed to think strategically rather than emotionally if I was going to handle this situation properly. I couldn't think straight on my own, so I called Victor at work. I needed someone level-headed and experienced to help me figure out my next steps. When I told Victor what I had discovered, his response was immediate and clear. "You need a lawyer right now. Don't confront any of them yet." Victor had been through a complicated second divorce himself, so he understood exactly what I was facing. He made a phone call right there from my living room and put it on speaker so I could hear everything. He connected me with Olivia Thompson, a divorce attorney who had handled his case successfully. Since we lived in a fault state and I had clear, documented evidence of infidelity, Olivia told me I was in a very strong legal position. The fact that I had purchased the house before our marriage meant it wouldn't be considered marital property during divorce proceedings. The same protection applied to most of my investments and savings accounts that I had established before getting married. This was incredibly fortunate timing, since I had been building my financial security for years before Natalie entered my life. Olivia advised me to secure my finances immediately before anyone realized that I had discovered their affair. Victor drove me to the bank that same afternoon, and I moved the majority of our joint funds into a separate account under only my name. I was careful to leave exactly $5,000 in our joint account, enough to show that I wasn't trying to financially strand Natalie, but not enough to fund a new life with my brother. The rest of our joint funds, approximately $40,000, went into an individual account that only I could access. I also called my investment firm to verify that my premarital assets, which totaled about $125,000 in various funds, were properly documented as separate property that wouldn't be subject to division in a divorce. Everything was in order from a legal standpoint, which gave me some peace of mind during this incredibly chaotic time. By the time Natalie came home from her supposed hospital shift that evening, I had already set the wheels in motion for my response. Olivia was drafting divorce papers, Victor had helped me regain some composure and think strategically, and I had secured my financial assets. I made the difficult decision not to confront Natalie that night. I was still in complete shock from what I had discovered, and I needed more time to plan my approach carefully. "How was your shift today?" I asked when she walked through the door, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "Exhausting," she replied, launching into a detailed description of some fictional emergency room crisis that had supposedly kept her busy all day. I sat there watching her lie directly to my face, thinking about the emails where she had described meeting Greg at my mother's house that very afternoon, while I was working from home, completely oblivious to what was happening. The hardest part was pretending that everything was completely normal while my entire world was imploding around me. She asked why Victor's car had been parked in our driveway earlier in the day. Apparently, one of our neighbors had mentioned seeing it to her. I told her that Victor and I had been discussing a work project, which was technically another lie to add to the growing pile of deception in our household. Over the next few days, I had to act completely normal, while secretly setting everything in motion behind the scenes. I would go to work and maintain my usual professional demeanor, make small talk with Natalie in the evenings about mundane topics, and we even watched our regular Thursday night television show together on the couch. All the while, I was dying inside but maintaining this facade of normalcy while I prepared for the confrontation that was coming. During this period, I gathered all of my important personal documents and moved them to a safety deposit box at the bank. I froze our joint credit cards to prevent any large, unauthorized purchases. Victor even helped me install small security cameras in our common areas, which was completely legal since the house was my property, just in case they try to take or destroy anything valuable when this all comes out, he advised me, and I was grateful for his practical thinking during such an emotional time. Thomas from hospital administration reached out via text to check in on me, and I learned that he had actually seen Natalie and Greg together at a restaurant several weeks earlier. They had been acting much more intimate than in-laws should, and he had been trying to find an appropriate way to tell me about it. I thanked him for being a real friend and trying to look out for me, and I told him that I had managed to figure out the situation on my own. My plan for confronting everyone started forming on Sunday night while Natalie was in the shower. A text notification popped up on her iPad, which was sitting on the coffee table in our living room. The message was from Greg, and it said he couldn't wait to see her tomorrow at Mom's house. Here was proof that their affair was happening literally every single day, right under my nose, and they were using my own mother's house as their meeting place. That's when I decided it was time to orchestrate the perfect confrontation. I called my dad on Monday morning and asked if he would be available for a family dinner at our house that upcoming weekend. I told him I had some important good news that I wanted to share with everyone in person. "Are you sure you want to host this at your place? Your mom and I would be happy to have everyone over to our house instead," he offered, always being considerate. "No, I absolutely insist on hosting," I replied, thinking about how perfect it would be to confront all of them on my own territory, in my own house, where I had complete control of the situation. I invited both Greg and my parents to this special dinner, and I told Natalie that we needed to prepare for hosting a family gathering. She seemed noticeably nervous when I mentioned that Greg would be coming, and I could see the visible tension in her shoulders. She was texting constantly throughout that day, probably coordinating stories and alibis with both Greg and my mother to make sure they were all on the same page. In the days leading up to this dinner, I met with Olivia twice more to finalize all the legal preparations. She had complete drafts of the divorce filing ready to go, and everything was in order from a legal standpoint. Olivia called me on Thursday with a final update, letting me know that the divorce papers would be ready for pickup on Friday morning. I picked them up during my lunch break, and that manila envelope felt like it was burning a hole in my backpack for the entire afternoon. On the day of the dinner, I took the afternoon off work to prepare everything properly. I ordered food from this nice Italian restaurant downtown because there was absolutely no way I was going to spend time cooking for these people. I had the divorce papers ready in a manila envelope, and I prepared a separate folder containing printouts of the most damning emails for my dad to read. The security camera in the dining room was recording everything, just in case things got completely out of hand and I needed video evidence later for legal purposes. I had one additional surprise prepared for this confrontation. I had cashed out some of my stock options earlier that week and had a cashier's check for $12,000 made out to my dad. This was the exact amount that I knew my parents had recently loaned Greg to pay off his mounting credit card debts. I figured my dad should get his money back before our family completely imploded and Greg disappeared into whatever hole he was going to crawl into. My parents arrived first at 6:30 in the evening, right on schedule. Mom gave me this awkward, tight hug that felt forced and unnatural, and she immediately asked where Natalie was instead of making normal small talk. "She's upstairs getting ready," I replied, surprised by how steady and calm my voice sounded despite the rage that was building inside me. Greg showed up last at 6:45, fashionably late as always. He had this cocky, self-satisfied smile on his face that made me want to punch him immediately. He gave me one of those fake brotherly hugs with a backslap, acting like we were still close, and I had to use every ounce of self-control I possessed not to react violently right then and there. Natalie came downstairs wearing this red dress that I had bought her for our first wedding anniversary. The irony of her choice of outfit wasn't lost on me. We all sat down at the dining room table, and I managed to stay completely calm while making small talk about work, the weather, and Dad's golf game. Mom kept glancing nervously between Natalie and Greg throughout the meal, clearly anxious about something. Natalie barely touched her food and just pushed it around her plate, obviously too nervous to eat. After we had finished the main course, Dad raised his glass and said, "So what's this good news you wanted to share with all of us?" I smiled, reached under the table, and pulled out the manila envelope containing the divorce papers. "Actually, I do have something very important to share," I said calmly, sliding the envelope across the table directly to Natalie. "These are divorce papers." The entire room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Natalie's face went completely white as she stared at the envelope without opening it. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know everything, Natalie," I said, keeping my voice steady and controlled even though I was raging inside. "I know about you and Greg. I know about the baby that might be his. And I know about Mom helping you hide it all from me." Mom gasped dramatically, putting on this theatrical performance of shock and disbelief. "How dare you accuse them of such a thing? Natalie would never do something like that," she exclaimed, trying to sound outraged and protective. I cut her off immediately by pulling out the second envelope and sliding it across the table to my dad. These are printed copies of emails between Mom and Natalie, discussing the affair in explicit detail and coordinating how to hide it from me, I said, matter-of-factly. "This has been going on for at least 3 months, and they've been planning their meetings at your house while you're out golfing." Dad's hands were visibly shaking as he started reading through the printed emails. I watched as the color completely drained from his face with each page he turned. Greg suddenly stood up so fast that he knocked over his chair, the loud crash echoing through our dining room. "You had no right to go through her private emails," he shouted at me, like somehow my invasion of privacy was the real crime being committed here. His indignation was absolutely unbelievable. "I think I had every right to know that my wife is screwing my brother and might be pregnant with his kid," I replied, still keeping my voice level and controlled. "How long were you two planning to hide this from me, Natalie? Were you just going to pass this baby off as mine and let me raise it without ever knowing the truth?" Natalie immediately burst into tears, that ugly crying where her whole face scrunched up. "It's not what you think," she sobbed desperately. "I love you. It was just a mistake. It didn't mean anything." "A 3-month mistake with my brother while my mother actively covered for you?" I laughed, but there was absolutely no humor in it whatsoever. "And now you're pregnant with a baby that might not even be mine." Mom tried to reach across the table for the papers that Dad was reading, but he held them away from her protectively. "Patricia, what exactly is this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet in that way that meant he was absolutely furious. "Did you actually help them hide this affair from David?" His tone was calm, but I could see the rage building behind his eyes. My mother's face transformed from fake shock to complete panic in a matter of seconds. "Natalie told me she was absolutely sure the baby was David's," she said suddenly, immediately throwing Natalie under the bus to try to save herself. It was pathetic to watch. Dad looked up from the emails he was reading, his face now hard as stone. "Patricia, did you know about this affair?" he asked again. "Did you help them hide this betrayal from our son?" His voice was quiet, but absolutely deadly serious. Mom started crying then, trying to play the victim card like she always did when she was caught doing something wrong. "I was just trying to protect our family," she wailed dramatically. "Greg made a mistake, but breaking up the entire family wouldn't help anyone. I thought it would just blow over." Greg, that smug piece of shit, actually had the audacity to scoff at the whole situation. "Come on, it's really not that big a deal," he said dismissively. "Natalie and I connected on a deeper level. These things happen between people. David is always working anyway and barely pays any attention to her." Something inside me completely snapped when he said that. I stood up, walked around the table calmly, and punched him square in the nose with every ounce of strength I had. There was this satisfying crack sound, and blood immediately started pouring down his face and onto his shirt. He stumbled backward from the force of the impact, knocking over a side table and sending a lamp crashing to the floor. Mom screamed like someone was being murdered, rushing over to Greg frantically. "David, what is wrong with you?" she shrieked. Dad stood up then, and I had never seen him look more angry in my entire life. "Enough, Patricia! Our son just discovered that his wife and brother betrayed him in the worst possible way, and you're worried about Greg's bloody nose?" He pointed directly at Greg, who was holding his face and bleeding all over my dining room. "Get out of this house right now and don't come back." Greg held his bleeding nose, glaring at all of us with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he spat, blood dripping from his chin. "You're going to regret doing this to me." He stormed out the front door, slamming it so hard that the windows rattled. Mom tried to follow him immediately, but Dad grabbed her arm firmly. "You stay right here," he commanded. "We have a lot to discuss about your role in all of this betrayal." Natalie was still crying hysterically at the table, her mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks. "David, please, we can work through this somehow," she begged desperately. "I'm so sorry. I made such a terrible mistake. We can go to counseling. We can fix this." I turned to look at her, feeling nothing but cold contempt. "I want a paternity test when it's safe to perform one," I said firmly. "I need to know if this baby is actually mine. And either way, regardless of the results, we are completely done." I handed the cashier's check to my dad, who looked at it with confusion. "This is to pay back the money that Greg borrowed from you recently, to pay off his credit cards," I explained. "I figured you should get your money back before everything falls apart and he disappears." Dad looked at the cashier's check, then back at me with genuinely sad eyes that reflected years of disappointment in how his family had turned out. "Son, I want you to know that I had absolutely no idea any of this was happening," he said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. Mom was frantically trying to explain herself, saying she just wanted to protect Greg because he was her baby, that she knew what they were doing was wrong, but thought it would just be a temporary phase that would blow over, and that she didn't want to hurt me by telling the truth. Dad wasn't having any of her excuses. He told her to get her coat immediately because they were leaving right now. "We're going home, and you're going to explain to me exactly how long you've known about this and how much you helped them deceive our son," he said sternly. The disappointment in his voice was crushing to hear, even though it wasn't directed at me. After my parents left, the house felt eerily quiet except for Natalie's continued sobbing. We sat in complete silence for what felt like hours, surrounded by the wreckage of what I had thought was my life just a few hours earlier. Finally, she spoke in a small, broken voice. "What happens now?" she asked, not looking up from her hands. "Now you pack a bag and leave tonight," I said firmly. "This house is mine. It's not community property since I bought it before we got married. You have until tomorrow morning to figure out where you're going, but it absolutely will not be here." She nodded slowly, seeming to understand that there was no negotiating or changing my mind about this decision. Then she went upstairs to pack whatever she could fit in a suitcase. I sat alone at the dining room table, surrounded by the complete wreckage of what I had believed was my happy life, but feeling strangely calm for the first time in months. The worst possible thing had happened. All my fears had been confirmed, and somehow, I had survived the revelation. Everything from this point forward would be about rebuilding my life from scratch, and at least now I knew exactly where I stood. The next few weeks became a complete blur of lawyer meetings, paperwork, and legal procedures. Natalie moved out to stay with a friend from work. Interestingly, not with Greg, which suggested that their relationship wasn't as solid as they had pretended it was. I had the locks changed the very next day after our confrontation dinner, ensuring that none of them could access my house without my permission. The paternity test was scheduled to be performed once it was medically safe to do so without risking the pregnancy. Natalie agreed to the test without any argument, which surprised me. I think part of her was secretly hoping that the baby would turn out to be mine, thinking that biological connection might somehow change my mind about the divorce. Then, about 2 weeks after our explosive family dinner, I got served with legal papers. Greg had actually filed misdemeanor assault charges against me for punching him in the nose. The absolute nerve of this guy to press charges against me after everything he had done was almost beyond belief. My lawyer, Olivia, wasn't overly concerned about the charges, though. First offense, no weapon involved, and a situation with clear emotional provocation, she explained. It's not a legal defense per se, but the context could definitely work in your favor during sentencing. She made it clear that the court wouldn't completely ignore the assault, since violence is never legally justified, regardless of emotional circumstances. However, she felt confident that the context surrounding the incident would be taken into consideration when determining any penalties. 3 months later, we had our court hearing for the assault charges. Greg showed up with his arm around Mom, playing the victim role like a professional actor. I came with Olivia and 2 character witnesses from work, including Victor, who spoke eloquently about my history of professionalism and restraint in stressful situations. The judge carefully reviewed the incident, heard testimony about the circumstances that led up to the physical altercation, and accepted some contextual evidence regarding the affair, not as legal justification for my actions, but as background information to understand the emotional state I was in. In the end, the court found me guilty of simple assault and imposed a $500 fine. The judge noted that this was clearly an isolated incident in response to a deeply personal betrayal rather than a pattern of violent behavior. The judge didn't mince words, stating that I had allowed my emotions to override better judgment, but also implied that Greg was fortunate that things hadn't escalated much further than they did. Mom looked absolutely mortified throughout the entire proceeding, while Greg glared at everyone like he expected applause for his performance. Honestly, I considered that $500 extremely well spent. Dad called me the very day that the assault charges were originally filed, and he was absolutely furious. Not at me, but at Greg for having the audacity to press charges after what he had done to our family. Dad told me he had already taken concrete steps to remove Greg from his will entirely. When Mom found out about this decision, she apparently had a complete emotional meltdown, threatening to leave Dad if he went through with disinheriting her precious golden child. Dad told me exactly what I said to her in response. "You're welcome to leave if you want, but you should know that I'll make sure you get nothing in a divorce if you choose Greg over what's left of our family." Dad said that threat shut her up pretty quickly, and she stopped making ultimatums. My dad's financial situation is absolutely no joke, which explains why Mom freaked out so completely when Dad threatened to cut Greg out of his inheritance. He had worked for 30 years at his engineering firm, made smart investments throughout his career, and owned several valuable real estate holdings. No wonder Mom had such a panic attack when Dad threatened to remove Greg from his will. She was facing the reality that her favoritism and enabling behavior might cost them serious money. Dad told me that Mom's true colors really showed through this entire ordeal. She had raised Greg to believe that he could do no wrong and would always be bailed out of any consequences, and now she was facing the reality of what happens when you create such an entitled, irresponsible person. Dad said she was still moping around their house constantly, crying about how her family was falling apart, but at least she had finally stopped openly defending Greg's actions and making excuses for him. Dad came by my house about a week after our confrontation dinner, and he brought his entire toolbox with him. We spent the day repainting the living room and master bedroom, completely erasing any visual reminders of Natalie's decorating choices and design influence. We didn't talk much while we worked together, but when we finished the project, he put his hand on my shoulder and said something that meant more to me than he probably realized. "You're handling the situation better than I would have at your age. I'm genuinely proud of you, son." That validation from him was incredibly meaningful during such a difficult time. I went back to work after taking a week off to handle the immediate legal and personal fallout. Victor had told our entire team that I was dealing with serious family issues and needed space, without going into any specific details. When I returned to the office, I discovered that Victor had strategically moved my desk to a completely different floor from Greg's sales department. It was a smart move that I really appreciated. I found out later that Victor had also put Greg on a formal performance improvement plan, citing ethical concerns in his official personnel file. Technically, sleeping with your brother's wife isn't a fireable offense according to HR policies, but Victor was creative in finding ways to make Greg's work life as difficult as possible without crossing any legal lines or creating liability for the company. Natalie's deeply religious parents found out about everything when my dad felt they deserved to know what their daughter had done to their family. They were absolutely devastated by the news. Her father actually called me personally to apologize, saying they had raised her to have better values and moral standards than this. They told Natalie that she wasn't welcome in their family home until she found her way back to God and made serious amends for her behavior. It was pretty harsh treatment, but I honestly couldn't blame them for being so disappointed and disgusted. Greg and Natalie eventually ended up renting a small apartment together, though from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, they were far from happy in their new living situation. The reality of their relationship without the excitement of sneaking around and deceiving people had apparently lost much of its appeal. Mom was their only regular visitor, sneaking over to see them when she thought Dad wouldn't notice or find out about it. I made the decision to cut all three of them completely out of my life. I changed my phone number, blocked all of their email addresses, deleted them from all social media platforms, the works. I wanted absolutely no contact or communication with any of them. Dad was the only family member I continued talking to on a regular basis, and our relationship actually became stronger through this ordeal. The paternity test results came back several weeks later, and the baby wasn't mine. In many ways, this was actually a relief, because it meant I could have a completely clean break with no ongoing biological ties that would require me to maintain contact with any of them. The divorce proceedings went incredibly smoothly after the paternity results were confirmed. With the documented infidelity proven and the paternity test confirming that it wasn't my child, and since we lived in a fault state, Natalie received almost nothing in the settlement. I kept the house, all of my retirement accounts, and the vast majority of our shared assets. She didn't even attempt to fight the settlement terms because she knew she had absolutely no legal grounds to stand on, given her documented affair and the paternity results. Our mutual friends mostly took my side once they learned the full story of what had happened. A few people tried to stay neutral initially, saying there are always two sides to every story and they didn't want to get involved in drama. But those people faded away from both of our lives pretty quickly when they realized the magnitude of the betrayal involved. My real friends stepped up in amazing ways. They invited me over for dinner regularly, checked in on me consistently, and made sure I didn't isolate myself during the healing process. I threw myself completely into my work as a way to cope with everything that had happened. I took on a challenging new project rebuilding a major insurance company's entire security infrastructure. The 70-hour work weeks kept my mind occupied and prevented me from dwelling on the betrayal. Victor started grooming me for a technical director position, which was much faster career advancement than I had originally expected. but I was ready for the increased responsibility and leadership role. I also made the decision to join a gym and completely transform my physical health as part of rebuilding my life. I hired a personal trainer who absolutely kicked my ass 3 times a week with intense workout sessions. I lost the 15 pounds that I had gradually gained during my marriage and put on some serious muscle mass for the first time in my adult life. I started running again, something I had enjoyed in college but abandoned during my relationship. 6 months after the divorce, I was in good enough shape to complete a half marathon, which felt like a huge personal accomplishment. Dating was honestly the last thing on my mind for a very long time after everything that had happened. Friends kept trying to set me up with women they knew, thinking that getting back out there would help me move on, but I simply wasn't ready for that level of vulnerability again. Trust issues don't just disappear overnight, especially when the betrayal came from the people who were supposed to be closest to you. 6 months after everything had completely blown up, I found myself in a surprisingly good place overall. The divorce was completely finalized with all paperwork signed and filed. The assault charges had been settled with just a small fine that I considered money well spent. I had been promoted at work to the technical director position that Victor had been preparing me for. The house was finally starting to feel like it was truly mine again after I had renovated extensively and gotten rid of everything that reminded me of Natalie. I completely gutted and redesigned the master bathroom, installing new tile, new fixtures, and basically starting from scratch with everything. I converted the guest bedroom into a fully equipped home gym with weights, cardio equipment, and everything I needed for my fitness routine. I built a custom entertainment center in the living room and upgraded the whole media setup. The house became an ongoing project that kept my hands busy and my mind focused on positive, productive activities. By the time I was finished with all the renovations, the place looked absolutely nothing like the home where Natalie and I had lived together as a married couple. My financial situation was looking better than it had ever been in my life. The promotion came with a $22,000 salary increase, plus stock options that had significant potential value. I maxed out all of my 401k contributions, started a separate investment account for additional wealth building, and even began researching rental properties as potential income sources for the future. At 30 years old, I was in a much better financial position than most guys my age, especially without a wife draining my resources and making financial decisions that I didn't agree with. Then, completely out of nowhere, I received a text message from Mom asking if we could meet at a diner downtown. She said it was extremely important, and she needed to talk to me in person about something urgent. I agreed to meet her during my lunch break, making it very clear that I only had 30 minutes available, and this would not be a long conversation. When I arrived at the diner, I immediately regretted my decision to come because Mom wasn't alone at the table. Natalie was sitting right next to her, looking absolutely exhausted and run down, with a baby carrier positioned on the booth seat next to them. I almost turned around and walked out immediately, but Mom spotted me before I could escape and waved frantically to get my attention. I reluctantly went over to their table and sat down directly across from them, not bothering with any pleasantries or polite greetings. "What exactly is this about?" I asked bluntly, looking directly at Mom and ignoring Natalie completely. Mom had the decency to look uncomfortable and somewhat ashamed. "Your father doesn't know that I'm here meeting with you," she admitted right away. "But I needed to talk to you because Greg has been arrested." That definitely got my attention and interest. "Arrested for what exactly?" I asked. "He was caught embezzling money from your company, and he also got a DUI last week while he was out drinking," Mom explained, her voice cracking with emotion. "He's facing serious jail time for both charges. I need your help to bail him out of this situation." I just stared at her in complete disbelief. "You want me to bail out the brother who slept with my wife, got her pregnant, and then had the nerve to press assault charges against me when I punched him? Are you completely insane?" Looking more closely at Mom during this conversation, I could see that her usually pristine appearance had deteriorated significantly. Her designer handbag was scraped and worn-looking. Her manicured nails were chipped and neglected, and she generally looked like someone who had been cut off financially. Dad must have followed through on his threats to control her spending and access to money. Good for him for finally standing up to her enabling behavior. Natalie spoke up then for the first time, her voice small and defeated. "Greg left us right after Lily was born," she said, gesturing toward the baby in the carrier. "He said he wasn't ready to be a father and couldn't handle the responsibility. He started drinking heavily every day. Sometimes when he drank, he would get angry and push me around physically. I felt absolutely nothing hearing this. Not satisfaction that their relationship had imploded so spectacularly. Not pity for her current situation, just complete emotional numbness. "He hit her, David," Mom said desperately, like that revelation would somehow make me care about their situation or want to help them. And now she's completely alone with a newborn baby. She has no job, no support system, and no way to take care of herself. I looked directly at Natalie with complete indifference. "And what exactly do you want from me?" I asked flatly. She started crying again, tears streaming down her face. "I honestly don't know what to do anymore," she admitted. "My parents still won't talk to me or have anything to do with me. I can't work with a newborn baby and no childcare. Greg drained our entire bank account before he got arrested, so I have no money saved. I thought maybe you could help us out, just until I can get back on my feet financially." I sat back in the booth and looked at these two women who had completely betrayed me and destroyed my life, and who were now asking me for help because the guy they had chosen over me had proven to be exactly the worthless piece of shit that I had always known he was. The irony of the situation was almost laughable. "Where was all this family loyalty when you were actively helping them hide their affair from me?" I asked coldly. "When you convinced Natalie to try to pass off this baby as mine so I would unknowingly raise another man's child?" "I made a terrible mistake," Mom said, tears welling up in her eyes as she tried to look remorseful. "I thought I was protecting everyone in the family, but I realize now how wrong I was." "No, you weren't protecting everyone," I said flatly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You were protecting your favorite child, just like you always have. And now, you're still trying to choose him over everyone else, even after everything he's done to destroy our family." Mom leaned forward across the table, lowering her voice to almost a whisper. "Your father is being completely unreasonable about this whole situation. He's frozen all of our bank accounts so I can't access any money without his specific approval. He's even talking about filing for divorce if I don't completely cut ties with Greg." I looked at her with zero sympathy. "That sounds perfectly reasonable to me," I replied. "Dad is finally standing up for himself and refusing to enable Greg's destructive behavior anymore." I stood up from the table, reached into my wallet, and pulled out a single business card. I dropped it on the table in front of Natalie. "This is contact information for a women's shelter that helps single mothers in exactly your situation," I said. "They can provide you with housing, job training, childcare assistance, and all the support you need to get your life back on track. I won't help you personally, and I have no intention of bailing Greg out of the consequences of his own actions." I looked directly at Mom for what I intended to be the final time. "Don't contact me again about this or anything else. Tell Dad that I miss talking to him and he's welcome to call me anytime he wants, but you and I are done." I walked out of that diner without looking back at either of them. Sitting in my car afterwards, I waited for some kind of emotional reaction. Anger, vindication, maybe even pity for their desperate situation. But I felt absolutely nothing. They simply weren't my problem anymore, and I had no obligation to rescue them from the consequences of their own choices. I had successfully rebuilt my life from the ashes they had left behind, and I was doing just fine without any of them in it. That same night, Dad called me because he had figured out where Mom had gone and why she had been acting strange all day. He apologized profusely for her behavior and assured me that he had absolutely no intention of helping Greg in any way, regardless of what legal trouble he was facing. We ended up talking for almost an hour about normal father-son topics, my work projects, the house renovations, and even the new woman I had recently started seeing casually. It felt good to have a completely normal conversation with someone who actually cared about my well-being. Several months later, I heard through mutual friends and acquaintances that Greg had ultimately taken a plea deal to avoid a lengthy trial. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison for the embezzlement charges. Natalie had apparently moved back to her hometown and had reconciled with her parents just enough that they were willing to help her with the baby, though their relationship remained strained. As for my own life, the promotion at work had turned into an even better opportunity. A full director position overseeing a team of 15 security specialists. I had successfully purchased a rental property that was already generating positive cash flow and contributing to my long-term wealth building. I was actively planning a 2-week solo hiking trip through Yellowstone National Park for the following summer, something I had always wanted to do but had never made time for when I was married. My life certainly isn't perfect, and I still have days when I think about everything that happened and feel angry about the betrayal. But I'm consistently moving forward with my goals, and I've learned that I'm much stronger and more resilient than I ever thought possible. Some days, knowing that I survived the worst thing I could imagine and came out better on the other side. That knowledge alone is enough to keep me motivated and optimistic about the future.